The room was dark and cold, and the only sound was a low hum, like something deep was sleeping beneath the floor, and the air smelled strange, not like earth, not like anything he had ever known before. And when he opened his eyes, everything felt wrong. He was not in his bed, and he was not on earth, and he knew it right away because the ceiling above him was glowing a soft blue, and the walls moved slightly like they were breathing, and he was lying on something smooth and warm and golden. And then he remembered the last thing before this. He had been on patrol on Mars, wearing his suit, watching the red rocks and dust through his helmet when the sky suddenly turned black and light, swallowed everything, and he felt like falling in 1,000 directions, and then there was nothing now. He was here, and he was not alone. Tall figures stood in the center of the room with skin like silver glass and eyes like twin suns, and she was not human and not trying to hide it, and her voice came into his mind like a whisper and a scream at the same time. She told him he had been chosen. He looked around slowly and saw no windows, no doors, just the glowing walls and the humming sound and her, and he sat up, his muscles tight and ready. Even though he had no weapon and no suit and no idea where he was, the alien queen watched him with interest like he was both a prize and a problem, and she moved with grace, but there was power behind her. Every step like the ground would break if she wished. And she came closer and spoke again. She said her people were dying. She said their blood was getting weaker, their bodies fading, their future uncertain. She said they had studied many species and only one had what they needed. Human, she said he was the strongest among them, or so the scans had shown, and she had personally chosen him to carry her seed, to join with her to make a new line, one that could survive. The soldier stared at her and said nothing. His eyes moved to the corners of the room, the ceiling, the floor, his training running through his mind, every second counting, every breath staying calm as his heart pounded. He knew what this was, not a gift, not an offer, not a chance. This was a cage. He stood up slowly and faced her, and though she was taller and stronger and surrounded by her own kind, he did not look away. She smiled like someone who had just claimed a pet. He did not smile back. She told him there was no need to fear, no need to fight, that he would be cared for and honored. And given everything his kind had ever wanted, knowledge, safety, power, she told him that others would beg for this place. He still said nothing. She left the room, and the golden walls melted away, revealing more of the ship's shining halls filled with strange lights and tall guards with silver skin and glowing weapons and machines, floating without touch, and aliens moving through the air like birds in water. They led him to another room, larger, brighter, filled with plants and sounds of distant music, and a table of food more beautiful than anything he had seen before. Was told this was his space now, his private place, his new home, and everything here was for him. Clothes of soft fabric, books with floating pages, a bed that shaped to his body, a window showing stars moving slowly outside like they were watching. He sat down. He picked up a fruit that glowed softly and felt warm in his hand. He did not eat it. The door opened, and the queen entered again, alone this time, and she sat across from him, watching his face. She said she had studied humans. She said she knew their ways. She said she could make him love her if she wanted. He looked into her eyes and finally spoke. No, she blinked, surprised, maybe for the first time in her long life. No, he said it again, and then leaned forward and whispered something else, something cold, something sharp. You made a mistake. She laughed, but it was not a happy sound, and her fingers tightened on the edge of the table, and her eyes flared, and she stood and told him he would see the truth soon. When she was gone, the soldier sat back in the chair and closed his eyes for a moment. Then he opened them and began counting the lights in the ceiling, the tiles on the floor, the number of seconds between each. Hum from the wall. He touched the corner of the chair, testing the sharpness of the edge. He listened to the guard outside, breathing slow and steady. Was not planning to escape. He was planning to end this, whatever they thought they wanted from him. They would not get. I was a soldier, and they had just declared war. Asterisk. The lights above him changed color. Every hour, soft blue, then soft red, then soft green, like the ship was breathing, like time itself was being twisted and shaped into something else. And in this place, time had no meaning, only moments and movements and silence. Human soldier sat quietly on the edge of his strange bed, the material under him, soft like cloud, but warm like skin, and he kept his hands resting on his knees. Like a statue, like a warrior waiting for the call that never came. The alien queen had not returned since their last meeting. and he could feel something behind that silence, something deep and cold, like a wave rising far away waiting to crash down. Hard and heavy food appeared in the room like magic sliding out from the wall, in golden trays, full of things that glowed and sang and shimmered, but he never touched any of it, not once. Guards outside the door never spoke and never moved, but he knew they were not statues. He knew they watched him with hidden eyes, and maybe others did too, through the walls, through the lights, through the air itself. So he waited. He walked around the room with calm steps, measuring the floor, counting the lines in the wall, watching how the lights flickered for just 1 second every 100 steps, and how the air shifted when he stood near the left side of the mirror. He found the vent on the fourth day, behind the mirror under the lowest curve, where the smooth wall bent just slightly more than the rest, and he noticed how the sound changed there, like wind was whispering inside. Took a small piece of the bed frame, sharp enough to cut skin, but thin enough to hide under his fingernail. Then he used it to open the vent just enough to slide one hand inside. The vent was cold, dry metal and dust and something else. A shard broken from the vent's inner wall, sharp as glass and shaped like a tooth, and he smiled without smiling because now he had what he needed. He hid the shard under his belt, folded in cloth from the room's curtain, and walked back to the center of the room where he sat again, calm and quiet. Like before, later that day, the queen returned. She was dressed in something different now, long white robes with threads of light running through them like rivers, and she moved slower, like this was a special day. Like something important was coming. She spoke with a softer voice, almost kind, and said she had decided to begin the joining process, the bond, the first step of many before the future they would build together. He said nothing. She told him that resistance would be pointless, that he would understand her beauty, her power, her purpose with time, and that he would thank her in the end. He just looked at her. Her face tightened for just a second, then relaxed, and she turned away and told the guards to prepare him for the coming ceremony, and then she left. Again, they brought him to a new room, bright and full of symbols carved into the walls, symbols that looked alive and changed every time. He blinked, and he was told to wear the robe on the chair and walk to the circle in the center. Did not follow right away. He took slow steps, like he was thinking, like he was afraid, like he was giving in, and the guards moved closer, but not fast because they believed they had already won. He reached the center of the circle and looked at the ceiling, and then slowly reached for the robe, pretending to adjust it. And that was when he moved fast like lightning, strong like thunder. He pulled the shard from the cloth and struck the closest guard across the neck where the armor was weakest, and before the second one could react, he drove the shard into the soft spot below its shoulder and twisted hard blood. Dark and thick, hit the floor like ink, and silence fell over the room for 2 heartbeats, then the alarm screamed through the ship. He grabbed the fallen guard's weapon, a small but deadly blade-shaped like a crescent, and ran back through the door before it could close, locking eyes with the stunned aliens outside. He did not run wild. He ran with purpose. Every step was planned. Every corner remembered from the maps he built in his mind. Every light flicker, every guard's face, every door he had seen from his room. He found a dark hall with no cameras and no lights, where he stopped just long enough to breathe and listen. Ship was alive with motion, now alarms, lights, voices, guards, but he had something they did know, had fire, not just in his hands, but in his soul. This was not fear. This was not weakness. This was war waiting to explode. He sat in the shadows and cleaned the shard with part of his robe and thought about Earth, thought about freedom, thought about the queen and her perfect voice and perfect lies. He whispered to the dark around him, "You should have never taken me, you should have never made me your choice now. I will become your mistake." The throne room was a place of silence and stars high above a wide open floor made of black stone that glowed like wet glass, and on the far end the alien queen sat tall and proud on her throne. Carved from a crystal that hummed with power and memory, around her stood her most trusted warriors, guards in shining armor, with faces hidden behind smooth silver masks, their hands resting on weapons that never slept, and behind them shadows moved like whispers, quiet and cold. The room had been prepared for a ceremony not of war, but of union. Flowers with glowing petals floated in the air. Soft music played from unseen instruments, and a red carpet of energy stretched across the floor, waiting for one man. That man was human. He walked slowly, down the path, wearing the robe they had given him, long and golden, with strange symbols along the edges, and behind him the doors sealed shut with a hiss, locking the room from the outside. Everyone watched the queen rose from her throne with a graceful movement, her silver skin shining under the soft lights, and she spoke with a voice that echoed without sound, reaching into every corner of the room and into the minds of those present. She spoke of destiny, of peace, of creation. She said that today was not just for her or for him, but for the stars themselves, for the future of their kind and his. And at this moment would begin a new age of unity and strength. The human soldier said nothing. He stepped forward closer to the queen, and the music stopped, the lights dimmed. Again, silence fell like snow. He stood before her, eyes calm and still like the surface of deep water. And the queen smiled and raised her hand toward him, and everyone leaned closer to witness the bond, to witness history, to witness the moment when two species would become one. That was when it happened. The human reached inside his robe and pulled out the blade. It was not large, but it was sharp and fast and real, and he moved with the speed of someone who had waited too long and planned too much and lost too many chances already. The blade sliced through the nearest guard before the others even understood what was happening, and in a blink, the soldier turned and threw the weapon into the neck of the second one, who fell with a sound that broke the silence like thunder, and glass panic rose. The queen stepped back, her smile gone, replaced by something cold and ancient, and she shouted something in her language, in the room exploded with movement. Guards rushed forward, weapons drawn, lights flared red, and alarms screamed from every wall, and the floating flowers burst into sparks and ash. But the human was already moving. He grabbed the weapon from the fallen guard, a long staff that bent and shifted into a blade, and he spun it in his hands like it was part of his body and charged into the chaos with fire in his eyes. He fought like no one they had ever seen. He did not aim to escape. He aimed to send a message that he was not theirs, that he was never going to bow, that Earth did not raise pets. He cut through armor like paper and ducked under blasts of blue light and threw his blade with perfect aim again and again, and with every scream, every fall, the room grew darker and quieter and colder. Queen watched from the steps of her throne, frozen not with fear, but with rage, the kind of rage that could tear stars apart, and she raised her hand and summoned something large and terrible from the ceiling, a machine, a guardian tall as the room, and shaped like a god with arms of fire and eyes of metal. It dropped into place between her and the soldier, and it roared with sound that broke the air, but the soldier did not stop. He ran straight at it and leapt high above its reach and landed on its shoulder and drove the staff into the crack behind its neck and twisted until the lights inside it died like fading suns. Collapsed to the floor, shaking the walls and breaking the crystal steps, and the queen stepped back again, her eyes burning. With fury and disbelief, you were chosen, she said. You were given everything. He stood over the broken machine and looked up at her with blood on his hands and smoke in his hair, and he spoke clear and sharp, like a blade. I did not choose you. The doors behind him burst open. Dozens of guards rushed in, too late, too slow, and the soldier turned and ran through them with fire in his veins and silence in his heart. He vanished into the halls before they could stop him. Behind him, the throne room lay broken, covered in blood and sparks and silence. The queen looked down at her hands and then at the empty path, and her voice trembled, not with fear, but with something worse doubt. She had wanted a mate. She had chosen a human, but what she got was war. Asterisk. The halls of the alien ship were quiet again, but it was not the quiet of peace. It was the quiet of fear. He had vanished like smoke after fire, and the guards were too slow, too blind, too proud, and now the queen stood inside her shattered throne room, staring at the blood that stained the floor in her hands, still shaking, not from pain, but from something she could not name. She had called her council. They sat in a circle of light, faces sharp and eyes glowing, robes filled with ancient markings, and they spoke with voices that echoed across the chamber like thunder without sound. They asked what had gone wrong. They asked why the human had turned. They asked if the queen had lost control. She raised her head high and told them no. She said he would be captured again. Soon she said he would be cleansed and corrected and remade into something useful. She said she would break him herself, if needed, deep in the lower decks far from the golden halls. The soldier moved through darkness. His clothes were torn, his arm was bleeding, and his body ached with every breath, but his eyes stayed sharp, his mind stayed ready, and every step took him closer to something he had not come this far to run. He had not spilled blood to hide. He had come to end this. He found a service shaft behind a cracked wall near the ship's energy lines and crawled. Inside, ignoring the heat and the pain and the strange humming in his ears, he followed the sound of machines, and he found the lab. It was cold and clean and full of glass tanks lined with blue light. And inside those tanks were others humans. Some were asleep, some awake, some no longer moving, some had wires in their heads, some had metal in their bones. He stood in silence for a long time as his hands curled into fists and his breath grew heavy. Then he moved to the nearest tank and smashed the control panel with a piece of broken pipe, and the liquid drained and the glass fell, and the human inside gasped and opened her eyes. One by one he freed them, 2 men. 3 women, 1 child, none of them older than 20. They were weak, but they stood and followed him without question, because something in his face, something in his fire told them this was the only way. They moved through the ship like shadows through a storm, finding weapons and maps and codes dropped by careless guards who no longer believed they were safe. And when the soldier found the communication room, he did not hesitate. He turned on the signal, he pressed the keys, and opened the frequency. To deep space, he sent a single message in human code, something simple, something Earth would hear and understand. Captured war begins now. Then he destroyed the console. He knew they would come now. He knew the Queen would hear it, and she did. She stood before the shattered screen in the upper tower of the ship, her council silent behind her, and her heart burned with fury like a black sun. She gave the order, "Bring him back alive," she said. "Break his bones if needed, tear his mind if you must, but bring him." Breathing and screaming and kneeling, she wanted the fire to die in his eyes, and she wanted to be the one to watch it happen. Her scientists prepared the machines. They called it the Room of Truth, a place where even stars would weep, and when they caught him 2 days later, after a battle near the engine core, after smoke and fire and shouts through the ship, after he sent 3 guards falling to the floor with weapons still blowing in their hands, they dragged him to that room and chained him to the chair. The Queen watched from behind the glass, her face calm, but her hands trembling. The machine started with light-blinding flashes that bent the mind and burned memory. Then sound voices twisted into screams, into laughter, into silence, into madness. Then pressure pain that moved through the bones like ice and fire dancing together until the soul forgot its shape. But the soldier did not scream. He stared forward, eyes open, jaw tight, breath slow like a mountain, refusing the wind. They raised the levels, they bent the rules. They whispered fears into his ears. They showed him Earth burning, his family crying, his home in ruins. But he did not look away. One of the scientists stepped back, afraid. "He is not breaking," she said. "He is waiting." The Queen leaned closer. To the glass she whispered something only he could hear. "You will break." And he whispered back, "You already have." The machine stopped, but the pain stayed inside his bones like fire that would never die. And the room was silent now, except for the sound of his breath, steady and low like a storm waiting behind the clouds. He was still in the chair, but the chains were loose now because the guards thought he was weak. They thought he was broken. They thought he would not move again. They were wrong. He listened as they spoke outside the room, voices low and proud, talking about sending him back to Earth as a warning, or turning him into a tool, or erasing his mind completely. He kept his eyes closed and waited. When the door opened, he moved fast. Like thunder sharp, like lightning, his hand grabbed the nearest guard, pulled him forward, slammed his head into the wall, and used his body to block the others. The second guard raised a weapon, but the human was already moving, using the first guard's blade to slice the air, and the second one fell without a sound. He took the key from the belt, unlocked his arm chains, and stood up slowly, blood dripping from his fingers, fire burning in his eyes. He walked through the door like a ghost, wearing shadows and rage. The hall outside was narrow and dark, the lights flickering weak and scared, as if they could feel what was coming. He moved without noise, without fear, without doubt. Every corner was familiar, every path remembered, every blind spot marked in his mind from days of watching and waiting. He found the others in the storage deck behind a sealed door, hidden beneath boxes of metal and light, the same humans he had freed in the lab, weak but alive, afraid but angry. And when they saw him, their faces changed, like the wind had returned, like hope had teeth again. "We fight," he said. They nodded together, they moved. Through the ship, like a fire with no sound, they took weapons from the dead and clothes from the fallen and maps from the wall. He led them to the power core, the heart of the ship where the light was brightest and the walls hummed like drums in a distant war. He knew the queen would hear them soon. He wanted her too. He wanted her to watch her perfect ship burn from the inside. Placed the charges taken from the armory, from the drones, from the failed experiments, and he wired them with hands steady as stone. The others stood guard, ready to die if needed, ready to kill if ordered one. The final wire was placed. He touched the wall and whispered a name not his own, not her own. Just a memory from Earth, something soft, something lost then. He ran. They moved fast through the maintenance tunnels, climbing, crawling, bleeding, never stopping. The ship groaned behind them, angry, confused, afraid. The queen stood in the tower, her eyes locked on the screen as the red lights filled her map one by one. Knew the sound of war. She had started enough of them, but this one felt different. This one felt like something ancient had awakened, something she could not control. She shouted for her guards, for her scientists, for her machines, but it was already too late. He reached the broadcast room with the others, the last signal tower on the ship, the last chance to scream into space before silence took them all. He turned it on. He looked into the screen. He spoke. This is not a message. This is a warning you took. You heard us. You lied now. We return the favor is coming. Then he smiled. He pressed the detonator. The ship shook. The lights died. The walls cracked. Fire burst from the floor and the ceiling, and the queen screamed, but no one could hear her over the roar. The humans ran toward the escape pods, machines falling behind them, systems crashing around them, alarms screaming in a language no one understood. One pod left. He forced them inside. The survivors, the broken, the brave. They shouted for him to follow. Shook his head. He turned back. Someone has to stay, he said. Someone has to finish this. The pod launched. He watched it disappear into the stars. Then he turned toward the flames, toward the queen, toward the final battle asterisk. The sky above the moon was black and wide, filled with stars that blinked like quiet watchers as the broken alien ship came down like a wounded beast, fire trailing behind it and metal screaming across the heavens. It hit the ground hard, sending dust flying for miles, and the sound rolled across the surface like thunder through stone. And when the silence returned, only pieces of the ship remained glowing, smoking, sparking in the cold. Dark from the wreckage, a shadow rose. The human soldier climbed out through twisted steel and shattered glass, blood on his face, fire behind his eyes, every step slow and heavy, but filled with purpose. He was not dead. He was not done. Far from the crash on a sharp cliff, the queen stood, wrapped in torn silk, her crown gone, her skin marked with burns and cuts, and her eyes wild with fury. She had survived, but nothing around her had. Her guards were gone, her council dead, her power turned to ash, and the one responsible was still walking, breathing, standing between her and whatever future she had left. She screamed into the wing, her voice carried across the moon like a blade through silence, and in response a signal blinked from her wrist, a call for her last drones, the final machines. Buried under the moon's surface for moments like this, the ground opened. Metal soldiers rose from the dust, tall and cold, with blue eyes and arms like cannons and mines made for war, not thought, not mercy, not peace. They turned toward the human. He did not run. He reached into the wreckage and pulled out a broken spear, torn from the body of a dead guardian, and held it in both hands like a banner and a warning. Then he walked forward. The first drone fired. He rolled beneath it and came up swinging the spear, smashing it through the core and sending the machine to the ground in sparks and silence. The others moved in. He fought like fire and wind, fast and wild, never stopping, never hesitating, using every piece of metal, every crack in the ground, every second like a weapon. The queen watched from the cliff, her face still cold, but her hands shaking with every drone that fell. She had called for a mate and created a monster, and now the monster was coming for her. He reached the base of the cliff, breathing hard but never slowing, and began to climb with bare hands and bleeding fingers, pulling himself up through sharp rock and dust. At the top she waited, holding a staff made from the bones of ancient kings and the light of dying stars, and her voice filled the sky. Again, this ends now. He stood tall and looked at her. Yes, he said, and he charged. The queen struck first, her staff blazing with white fire, cutting across the sky like lightning, but he ducked under it and slammed into her chest, sending both of them crashing to the ground. They rolled across the dust, hitting stone, clawing, kicking, striking again and again, dust rising around them like smoke from a dying world. She screamed and struck his face with her staff. He grabbed it and snapped it in two. She threw sand into his eyes and tried to stab him with a hidden blade. He took the cut and drove his elbow into her jaw. They fought like gods in ruins, but only one had something left to protect. She rose to strike again, but he caught her wrist and held it tight and looked into her eyes. You could have asked, he said. You could have asked, and maybe we would have helped, but you took, you hurt, you burned everything. She spat in his face. We are better than you. He pulled her close. Then why are you the one begging for mercy? He threw her to the ground and stepped back. She reached for a second blade, but stopped because behind him the sky had changed. Lights filled the darkness. Dozens of ships descending from orbit, marked with the flags of Earth, strong and shining and full of soldiers who had followed the signal, who had heard the warning, who had come not to speak but to finish. The Queen stared as the ships landed one by one, dust flying engines, roaring weapons locked. The human turned away from her and walked toward the light, his body broken, soul burning. He did not look back. She knelt on the ground, crownless, breathless, forgotten. The war was over, and she had lost. The ground shook with the force of the landing ships, their engines roaring like storms across the ancient moon as Earth arrived, not with questions, not with peace, but with steel fire and fury. Soldiers poured out of the ships in rows of black armor, eyes glowing with data rifles, humming with quiet energy boots, crushing the dust of a dead empire. And at the front of them stood a new commander, tall, silent, wrapped in the flag of Earth, and behind his visor burned the reflection of a war just ended, another just beginning. Found him walking alone across the rocky plain, blood dried on his face, body bruised, eyes locked on the stars above, as if measuring the distance between pain and peace. He did not salute. He did not speak. He just pointed back toward the cliffs where the Queen still knelt like a statue cracked by time and truth. The commander nodded and sent the orders. The soldiers marched toward her with slow steps like judges in a forgotten court, rifles raised but fingers off the triggers, waiting for the command, waiting for the final word. She looked up as they approached her, silver skin, dull now, eyes tired but proud, still filled with ancient pride that refused to break even when her world had to not understand. She said, "We were trying to survive. We were trying to rise." The commander said nothing. He just looked at her like a man who had seen too many excuses, too many lies, too many children, taken too many wounds that never healed. She was taken away without a fight. No one cheered. No one smiled. Victory was not sweet. It was quiet, heavy, like the silence after a storm, when nothing moves and even the wind forgets how to breathe. A human soldier stood on the edge of the landing zone, watching as the pieces of the alien ship still burned, watching as the Earth banners rose on the moon's empty soil, watching as the stars blinked without care. He did not feel triumph. He did not feel revenge. He only felt the weight of what had been lost and the fire of what must never be forgotten. The rescued humans stood behind him, now stronger, cleaner, dressed in new uniforms, their eyes no longer full of fear, but a purpose one. Stepped forward the girl who had been in the lab, the one with the scars across her arms, and asked what happens. Now he looked at her and said something soft. Now we make sure this never happens again. The Queen was taken to a cold cell on a ship without name, placed behind walls of steel and silence, far from stars, far from command, far from choice. She never spoke again, not to the guards, not to the cameras, not to herself. She just stared at the floor as if looking for the crown that had fallen and been buried in dust and blood. Earth did not hold a trial. There was nothing left to prove. Across the galaxy, her people heard what had happened, and some wept and some raged and some vanished into the dark corners between systems, where no law, no truth, no human hand could reach, but none dared rise again because they had seen what happened when you touched the fire and called it weak. The soldier did not return to Earth with the others. He stayed behind on the moon, walking among the ruins, sleeping under the stars. Eating little, saying less, he built a small tower from the broken pieces of the alien ship, a monument with no name, no flag, no weapon, just a single message carved into the stone by hand. Over days of silence and thought, freedom has a price. Left the moon before the year ended, flying alone in a small vessel gifted by command, and no one knew where he went. Some say he returned to Earth and lived quietly near the ocean, fishing in the mornings, watching the sky at night. Some Say he joined a hidden force that watches the stars, waiting for the next threat, the next queen, the next mistakes. Some say he became something more, something beyond human, something shaped by pain and steel, and one can prove it. But across 1,000 systems, his name became legend, whispered in dark rooms, shouted in training halls, etched into the walls of ships that patrol the border between peace and terror. He had no crown, no throne, no home, but he had something stronger. He had the truth, he had the fire, and that was enough forever.